Well, I mean, Mimi really needs no introduction. I mean, I've not met her in person, but I feel that I know quite a bit about her work because she's been really prolific, and she is Professor of Sociology, as well as Founding Director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And I think many of us also know her as one of the founding editors of the Mobilities Journal, and of course, one of the foremost proponents and thinkers about what's been called the mobilities paradigm, and that is part of the inspiration behind this particular workshop. So I'm really very delighted to have her speak to us today. She's author, co-author, editor of many, many books. I think she specifies 9 here. I'm sure there are many more articles and all that, which will fill the page, but I just wanted to highlight that the book that she edited, the Routledge Handbook of Mobilities in 2013, that's been, I think, a really useful intervention in the field. So we're very pleased to have with us Professor Mimi Schiller to speak to us on her topic, Mobility Justice and the Temporalities of Multi-Scalar Migration.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time in Singapore, so I'm excited to see the city, but also to hear about the incredible scholarship you're doing here. And what a fantastic series of events we just heard that you've been sponsoring. And so nice to see all of you here, so thank you for coming out for this event. And you have to excuse my voice. It's a little bit hoarse. So I think I'll be fine, but I'm glad to be speaking first before I lose it any further. So I'm going to be talking about mobility justice as one of the crucial political and ethical issues of our day, when the entire world faces the urgent question of how to make the transition to more environmentally sustainable and socially just mobilities. And my talk will have 3 parts. In the first, I will introduce the new mobilities paradigm, and I'm really pleased that scholars of migration studies are interested in the mobilities paradigm and mobilities research, because the fields have an interesting relation to each other, and I really hope as part of this workshop we will be working out what that relationship is, how it could move forward, and also where it's come from. Secondly, I will talk about kind of finding common ground between migration studies and mobility studies as fields, as approaches, as different kind of intellectual trajectories. And then thirdly, focusing more specifically on our conference theme of temporalities and kind of thinking what can mobilities approaches bring to thinking about the temporalities of migration. So in the introduction, I will be drawing on some concepts that are being developed more fully in a book that I have in progress called Mobility Justice, The Ethics of Transport, Travel, and Migration. The project draws on mobilities studies to develop a multi-scalar spatio-temporal approach to the ethics of many different interacting relational kinds of mobility and immobility. This approach acknowledges the interconnected relation between bodily encounters, urban space, transport infrastructures, state territoriality, and global relations of power that influence relations of mobility and immobility, including those related to migration. The multi-scaling of mobility justice, I will argue, suggests the need also for multiple temporalities in our approach to migration, from what I think of as the micro-temporalities of day-to-day bodily encounters, to the meso-level temporalities of the life course and generations and family relations, to even the planetary temporalities of resource extraction, mining, energy consumption, climate change, and natural disasters. So I'm seeking to sort of draw together those different temporalities and those different scales. Before turning to questions of mobility and migration, though, I first want to offer a brief overview of the field of mobilities research, especially for those who might be less familiar with it. The formulation of a new mobilities paradigm emerged 10 years ago in the context of several theoretical shifts, methodological developments, and research questions and approaches that were emerging at the time that I published the article with John Urry called the New Mobilities Paradigm in 2006. Mobilities research focuses on the constitutive role of movement within the workings of social institutions and social practices, and the organization of power around systems of governing mobility and immobility. So the claim here is not simply that the world is more mobile than ever, which I associate with the sort of globalization literature of the 1990s. And it's certainly not meant in the sense of there being more and more freedom of mobility in today's world. Rather, the complex character of mobility systems stems from the multiple fixities, or what we call moorings in some of articles, often on a substantial physical scale, but also in a cultural sense, moorings that enable other things to be fluid. Such systems are culturally shaped and politically governed by mobility regimes, including legal regimes that govern who and what can move, but also who and what can stay put or dwell, when, where, and under what conditions. Importantly, as I've emphasized elsewhere, mobilities research does not focus simply on movement per se, and a lot of people mistake it as being about movement, but rather it's on the power of discourses, practices, and infrastructures of mobility in creating the effects of both movement and stasis. Thus, it has important antecedents in the study of transnational migration and the anthropology of circulation, as I'm sure many of you are probably very familiar with, including the rejection of methodological nationalism, which Wimmer and Glick-Schiller wrote about back in 2002, and the focus on the lived experience and meanings of mobility, which many of you are researching in your own projects. Secondly, work within the new paradigm examines different modes of mobilities and their complex combinations, including at least this set: corporeal travel of people, physical movement of objects, virtual travel transcending distance via mediated experiences, communicative travel through person-to-person messages, and imaginative travel in the form of visual imaginaries, travel narratives, and forms of anticipation. Social institutions and practices, including those relating to migration and borders, presuppose contingent assemblies of these diverse mobility forms for various kinds of meetings, movement, and connectivity, as John Urry has argued in much of his work. Thus, the study of mobilities is not only about moving from point A to point B, but also about potential mobility, the meanings and embodied experiences of movement, and also how these relate to meanings and experiences of staying still, of waiting, of dwelling, of being detained, or being deported. As discussed in the paper by Diana Ibanez Tirado, waiting is part of the experience both of labor migrants and their relatives, and the desirability of mobility should not be assumed, and the lack of mobility of those who are in the place of origin should not be assumed as a form of immobility. Thirdly, in the New Mobilities paradigm, we focus on the complex assemblies of movements and moorings within these mobility forms. Mobilities are organized in and through systems, and such mobility systems presuppose immobile infrastructures. But these are not only physical, but also involve things like regulations, legal and juridical systems, bureaucracies, codes and violations, and social practices. So mobilities are never free, but are always in various ways channeled, tracked, controlled, governed, under surveillance, and always unequal. They are striated by gender, race, ethnicity, class, caste, color, nationality, age, sexuality, disability, etc. Mobility is therefore relative, with different historical contexts being organized through specific constellations of uneven mobilities. And in this perspective, migration exists in relation to various instances of mobility that may include tourism, educational travel, medical travel, return visits, temporary work, emergency evacuation, and many other kinds of moves. And finally, the New Mobilities paradigm involves analyzing networks, relations, flows, and circulation not fixed places, yet it does not fetishize flow. It does not promote a nomadic way of life or seek to glamorize highly mobile elites, as certain public discourses of globalization did in the 1990s and early 2000s. It came after that. It's a critical approach to that, and sometimes we feel like critics of the mobilities paradigm mix it together with that earlier approach. It does challenge the idea of space as a container for social processes, while also seeking to extend beyond human mobilities to better understand their relation to non-human mobilities and to various forms of power and privilege that are constituted in and by regimes of mobility and its governance. Especially significant here is the concept of network capital, described by Eliot and Urey. Network capital encompasses capacities to be mobile, including things like appropriate documents, money and qualifications, access through technology to networks at a distance, physical capacities for movement, location-free information, contact points, meeting places, time and other resources for coordination. Kaufman and Montulet more generally define a capability for potential mobility through the concept of motility. Motility can be defined, they say, as the manner in which an individual or group appropriates the field of possibilities relative to movement and uses them. And by that, they mean they may move or they may not move. There's a field of possibilities, and some subjects have greater possibilities to determine their own mobility, and so they have a higher degree of motility. For me, this implies that beyond a rights-based approach to mobility justice, it would be important to develop a capabilities approach associated with the work of political philosophers Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. And this may be especially appropriate to understand the distribution of differential potentials for mobility and immobility. So, I believe that mobility struggles and contested notions of mobility justice are key topics for future research, and I hope to do that in my forthcoming book. But now I want to move on to talk about general concerns with critically addressing normative issues of mobility justice. Of course, we all know that the contemporary global migration crisis, as some describe it, of thousands of people dying as they attempt to cross borders in the European Union, but also in the Americas, and I'm less familiar with the Asian situation, but I hope you will all teach me more about it. It's one of the most important mobility justice issues of the 21st century. The European Union today is being deeply tested by the hundreds of thousands of displaced people trying to enter, especially via Greece, as shown in this map of migration routes into Germany. The United States, likewise, has been deeply politicized in its reactions to the U.S.-Mexico border, especially recent crossings by Central American migrants, including thousands of unaccompanied minors who are affected by extreme violence in their homelands. And we also hear about, in where I am, of Australia's efforts to intercept and keep out migrants and detain people on remote islands, which has been equally contentious. In these particular cases, the debate over border politics has not only affected attitudes of and towards immigrant communities already within the borders of the nation, but has also contributed to new kinds of bordering practices that affect both immigrants and non-immigrant citizens. There's a temporal sense of a migration crisis or a refugee emergency, which has given rise to new modes of government and has given the question of borders and migration a particular political urgency. So I think it's very important that we are working on this issue now and that you all are working on this issue. So in the paper, I'm going to turn to how some of key ideas from mobilities research can inform current work in migration studies, and also what we in mobilities research might learn from migration studies, building on traditions in both fields. In particular, I want to focus on examples of friction or turbulence, or what I refer to as uneven mobilities, as they relate specifically to temporalities of migration. Uneven mobility has multiple registers. For me, it could refer to a terrain for movement in which there are uneven geographies, right? Divergent pathways, differential access, partial connectivities, and disconnectivities, so it's uneven in a sort of geographical sense. It also could refer to means or modes of movement that have a kind of uneven quality to them. That is, a greater or lesser degree of ease, comfort, flexibility, safety. And we think of people trying to cross the Mediterranean in rubber dinghies from Turkey, crossing from North Africa in small boats versus cruise ships, and the different sort of feel of those modes of movement. It also might suggest embodied experiences of movement, where from a subjective point of view there's more or less friction, noise, speed, or turbulence. And finally, it could refer as well to spatial patterns and control architectures, such as airport screening areas, border checkpoints, detention camps, that govern such relations of mobility and immobility, speed and slowness, comfort and discomfort. So I want to ask, how can our understanding of transnational migration build connections from the micropolitics of racial, gendered, classed, enabling or disabling embodiments and environments as everyday lived experiences, to the macro-level geopolitics of rights to migration, border crossing, travel, and residency? And then ultimately, and I'll go into this less today, but ultimately I'm also thinking about wider geo-ecological understandings of the deeper temporalities of energy flows and material resources that move around the world, shaping its spatial territories and legal territorialities. What, I want to know, can these things teach us about migration's temporalities? And I should say this image, for me, is a great representation of friction, noise, speed, and turbulence. This is from a Haitian tap-top bus in which the people sitting on the top, you'll notice, are on top of a painted jet, airliner. And this is a form of air travel, right? And many Haitians do not have access to international air travel. So it's really interesting to me that they represent it this way on their local form of transportation as a hope, as an aspiration, as an imaginative mobility. So in the second part, I'm going to talk about migration studies and mobility studies and how we might find common ground between them. Since their beginnings, both mobility studies and migration studies have generated important critiques of sedentary or static models of society, territory, and belonging. This goes back, at least in how I learned of it, I would say, to the 1990s, work by Nina Glick-Schiller, Linda Bash, and Constance Zaunten-Blancs on transnationalism. It also links, though, to feminist work such as Karen Kaplan's Questions of Travel in 1996. And both of those informed my own interest in Caribbean mobilities, along with the work of anthropologists like James Clifford's work on traveling theory, on roots and routes, or roots and roots, and Apadarized modernity at large, and other work by anthropologists. So my own trajectory in the 1990s led to the publication of Consuming the Caribbean, my second book in 2003, which considers the relational mobilities and immobilities of people, commodities, plants, capital, and culture that formed the transatlantic world. And in the same year, my co-edited volume with Sarah Ahmed, Claudia Castaneda, and Anne-Marie Fortier, called Uprootings, Regroundings, Questions of Home and Migration. And these sort of origins of my own interest in mobilities suggest the emphasis from the beginning on roots, grounds, and homing, as well as on mobilities. It was my interest in Caribbean mobilities and immobilities that brought me to co-founding the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University with John Urry, out of which emerged the journal Mobilities in 2006. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year with some great special issues. I should promote, the new one is out and has a lot of great articles in it. And effectively, this was the beginning of what is now generally recognized as the interdisciplinary field of mobilities research. As the field spread, though, some participants in it were unaware of its origins in transnational anthropology, post-colonial history, cultural studies, and feminist theory. There was also some resistance from scholars in fields such as migration studies, I believe, who felt they had already made some of the points we were trying to make. And there's a great article in the new issue of Mobilities by ALLISON on the temporalities shaping the past and future dialogue between migration and mobilities research. She observes that while mobilities and migration research have shared concerns about how social relations span societies and how border crossings and global travel fuel transnational connections, their asynchronous engagement with these concerns limited the extent to which they have been examined as a part of mutually engaged interdisciplinary dialogues. That is, transnational migration studies came first, mobilities theorists came later, and there's been this kind of gap in the timing of how we speak to each other. So she calls for temporally situated and temporally sensitive accounts of these asynchronous fields to show what is at stake in the ordering of concepts. And this event, I hope, is one opportunity for trying to resync these divergent projects, calling attention to the sequencing of migration trajectories and their multiple mobilities, but also the sequencing of their study, with particular political moments and within particular interdisciplinary fields. So it's both the fields coming together and the sort of urgency of the contemporary moment of migration that I think calls for us to sort of think together. And I highlight this personal trajectory of my own engagement with the field in order to make three main points. First, I find it crucial to have a deep historical engagement with patterns of mobility across large geographical areas and time frames, rather than beginning from a singular national perspective or from the contemporary framing of the current migration crisis. Because there have been multiple kind of current migration crises, and I value sort of putting it in a deeper historical context and thinking about where these temporalities come from. So looking at the entire trans-Caribbean region, or trans-Atlantic region, or trans-Pacific region, or trans-Asian region, over the longue durée, as Fernand Braudel emphasized in his study of the Mediterranean, can help to elucidate multiple mobility processes, trajectories, and intersections. In such long-term perspectives, one also becomes acutely aware of the relation between mobilities and immobilities, of different forms of governance of mobilities and technologies for movement and boundary drawing, and the framing of contested meanings around different ideas of migration and belonging. Wider histories of liberal citizenship suggest that the right to unhindered mobility of the citizen helped to produce the nation state, even while it required others whose mobility is constantly hindered. And here I'm thinking of Hagar Kotef's recent study of liberal governances of mobility, called Movement and the Ordering of Freedom. And Kotef argues that liberal democracies have always operated in tandem with regimes of deportation, expulsion, and expropriation, as well as confinement and enclosure, implementing different rationalities of rule to which colonized, poor, gendered, and racialized subjects were subjected. For groups experiencing decades of displacement over generations, for example, like Adam Saltzman's study of Burmese migrants, there's a circular transnational migration that may become a precarious way of life. And I think here also of James C. Scott's work on escaping the state via mobility. Who is able to appropriate the potential for mobility or the potential to stay and to dwell in a place is both a political question, what rights to mobility exist and how are they exercised and protected, and for me it's also an ethical question, what capabilities of mobility are valued, defended, and extended to all. So my first kind of spatio-temporal lesson that I want to draw today is that migration should be seen in the long context of the formation of states, borders, and the governance of mobilities. There's a recent collection on Italian mobilities, for example, edited by Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Stephanie Home, which situates migration into and out of Italy in relation to the country's longer history of what they call mobility dispositions, and the relation of Italianness to discourses of unification, emigration, imperialism, and colonialism. And I want to read briefly from the foreword to the book, which they invited me to write. And I realize this workshop is about Asia, but I speak of areas which I know better, in this case, this book about Italy, in the hope that you'll be able to see parallels and maybe other kind of examples from this region that this might trigger thoughts about. And in that introduction, I wrote that Italy stands not only at the historical center of a world of ancient and early modern Mediterranean mobilities, with its sites and remnants so popular to tourists, but also as a launchpad of global mobilities out of Southern Europe to the Americas in the 19th to 20th centuries, as a participant in the colonial and imperial mobilities of the early 20th century so-called scramble for Africa, and as a crossroads of global mobilities out of North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East into Western Europe today. Though often treated as separate subjects of study, each of these eras of mobility and migration entangles and haunts the others, fraught with the baggage of blocked arrivals, hasty exits, patient waiting, and deaths at sea. Each era has been commemorated, visualized, archived, and mediatized in different ways, and these transcripts of mobility and migration leave traces upon the palimpsest of Italian mobilities. So that kind of work, as the editors argue, brings into focus temporalities as much as spatialities, highlighting experiences of return, of detention, and of suspended time, as much as the kinds of temporal progress implicit in so many mobility narratives. The diversity of mobile subjects found here, refugees, repatriates, migrants, settlers, detainees, guests, engages not only with physical mobilities, but also with communicative mobility, imaginary mobility, and virtual mobility. As Anne-Marie Fortier has argued, migration is not only about migrants. It is not only the experience of those who pick up and leave one place to settle in another. Migration is an integral part of the way the world is imagined, and as such impacts on how individuals, communities, nations, and multi-international formations, such as the European Union, imagine themselves and their co-inhabitants. Migration, she says, is part of an imaginative geography that shapes and is shaped by public cultures of assumption, disposition, and action. So because of this imaginative power, alternative representations can reshape the meanings of mobility and perhaps open up the possibility for ethical debate about practices of mobility that have been shaped by colonialism, racism, and violent histories, even when masked as care and hospitality, as rescue, and so on. So that's one point I want to make. And then secondly, I also draw on my own work because I want to talk about how I have sought to incorporate non-human mobilities into my perspective, looking not only at enslavement, migration, or tourism in the Caribbean, but also those mobilities associated with the accompanying movements of commodities, plants, animals, landscapes, texts, and representations. This has led more recently to my work on bauxite mining and aluminium smelting as part of a planetary urbanism that moves metals and energy around the world, displacing people and ecologies as it does so. As I've argued previously, the spatialization of mobility throws into relief who and what is demobilized and remobilized across many different scales, and in what situations mobility or immobility might be desired options, coerced, or paradoxically interconnected. Resource extraction and ecological destruction are one of the ways in which such spatio-temporalities of modern speed and peripheral backwardness or slowness construct uneven global mobility systems and their associated migrant trajectories. So-called advances in transportation and communication technologies over the last century were dependent on the extraction of oil, hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and light metals such as aluminium to make and power cars, trains, computers, cell phones, energy grids, and satellites. And I know today there's an ecological crisis in Malaysia due to bauxite mining, and it reminds us of the ongoing, continuing building of infrastructure requires resource extraction. And so the more mobile we become, the more we affect the places where other people live, destroy environments, pollute their water, their air, and destroy ways of life. So all kinds of mobilities are always grounded in these earthly materialities, which do calamitous damage to the natural environment and to settled ways of life, which in turn often drives further migration. Thus, I advocate for a deeper planetary and geo-ecological perspective on mobilities and migration, showing how human and non-human mobilities are deeply interconnected and part of complex, extensive systems of what Neil Brenner calls planetary urbanization. And lastly, I'll just mention one more kind of lesson about spatio-temporalities, which is that by beginning from my own thinking from the system of transatlantic slavery, in particular an interest that I had in women and slavery, I have always been interested in the ways that there are corporeal or bodily interpersonal politics of mobility and immobility, and that these articulate with the macro-scale mobilities of transnational migration. Mobility must be conceived in relation to spirit experiences of stillness, waiting, being stuck, and also in relation to negative figures of mobility, such as the runaway slave, the vagabond, the hobo, the refugee, the homeless, the streetwalker, and the rootless. And we might add the figure of the respectable woman as one who is not free to move in many contexts, who moves under constrained conditions, whether due to notions of honor and domesticity, restrictive modes of dress, legal restrictions, or outright threats and acts of violence against women. So the gendering of mobilities, and also thinking of Michael Bass's work, the queering of migration and struggles over sexual citizenship reminds us of these micro-macro relations and disjunctures in progressive narratives of the freedom of movement. There has never been a freedom of movement for so many people, and we need to kind of remember those relations to genders and sexualities. So with these historical contexts in mind, I now want to ask how mobility studies might further inform migration studies and vice versa. And I'll just point out that in the very first volume of its publication, the journal Mobilities, which I co-founded and I continue to co-edit, included a special issue on migration and mobilities, in which one of the guest editors, Anne-Marie Fortier, wrote a piece on Europe that considered the intersection of critical migration studies with mobilities research through the analysis of scales, temporalities, and corporealities. I think her observations resonate with the questions posed by the workshop today about migrations that are described as permanently temporary or continually circular, and how they engage with notions of transience and permanence. Her attention to figurations and the imaginary, which was also central to our co-edited project, Uprootings, Regroundings, helps us to understand how the migrant is deployed as a figure to mark various kinds of temporality and belonging. Migration is not simply an action, an event, or a move, but also a representation, an imaginary, and a figuration that makes worlds, whether worlds in motion or nostalgic memories of stable rootedness, whether nations under threat of inundation by others or nations imagined as welcoming the refugee and energized by diversity, whether communities of toleration and cosmopolitanism or ethno-national bordering that is closed and fearful of outsiders. These each deploy figurations of the migrant that interpret mobilities and immobilities in contrasting ways and stand in relation to each other, often through temporal narratives. At larger scales of both space and time, there's another new work by the political philosopher Thomas Nail, whose recent study of the figure of the migrant is especially helpful in systematically developing an analysis of the relation of mobility studies to migration studies. His historical analysis goes all the way back to the Neolithic period and the earliest human migrations, which he traces through the figures of the nomad, the barbarian, the vagabond, and the proletariat. Focusing on what he calls expansion by expulsion, he shows how land grabs for purposes of agriculture, mining, and taking water resources have driven migration flows and complex circulations in what he calls kinopolitics, or politics of movement. The kinopolitical framework gives us a way of understanding the temporalities of migration, including concepts he developed such as social periodicity, itinerancy, and recirculation. So studies at the intersection of mobilities and migration also point toward the interlinkage between once differentiated categories of travel, such as tourism, short work stays overseas, temporary migration, internal migration, international educational mobility, lifestyle migration, circular migration, return migration, step migration, birth tourism. There's been this proliferation of different ideas and concepts around various kinds of migration and mobility. And I think there's a complex relation between ongoing intended and unintended mobilities that need to be empirically studied. And many have argued for moving beyond the notion of voluntary versus involuntary migration, which is so often used to distinguish economic migrants from so-called economic migrants from refugees or asylum seekers. And instead, we can turn to approaches like the recent article Living in Mobility by Schruten, Salazar, and Diaz, who argue for the significance of mobility studies in rethinking migration. They show how for Brazilians currently living in Belgium and the UK, their experiences are marked by an ongoing mobility that consists of a multiplicity of potential routes, which are often unstable and which may be accompanied by change in social status. Migration for them is a kind of living in mobility, which they say is in fact a strategy for staying home rather than a one-way movement to elsewhere. And I think this might be similar to the arguments in some of the papers we'll hear at this workshop, Catriona Stevens concerning Chinese migrants in Perth, Australia, as well as Shanti Robertson's notion of staggered mobilities and how those intersect across timescales. As practitioners of ongoing movement, the Brazilians studied by Schruten, Salazar, and Diaz define themselves as sojourners rather than migrants, and they try to maintain their capacity to be mobile as long as possible, staying mobile rather than settling. Thus, they argue, the conceptual framework developed within mobility studies has the potential to enrich our understanding of the dynamics that constitute contemporary mobile people's experiences and to give insight into the mobilities under study. So I'll move on now to the final section of my paper. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Okay. Okay. So here I'm going to talk about kind of trying to theorize some temporalities of migration and mobilities, or migration in a mobilities perspective. And I'm going to give, I think, 4 different examples or concepts we might be able to use. The first concepts we might think about are differential speeds and friction, which suggest how different temporalities produce migration, as opposed to, say, the temporality of sudden flight, for example, evacuation from a disaster, or the rushed departure of a refugee, or the temporary sojourn of a visiting worker. So what's the sort of temporality of this thing that we call migration, and how is it different than those other temporalities? What is the relation between the relatively rapid time frames of fleeing, expulsion, eviction, and the somewhat longer temporality of seeking refuge or asylum, fleeing a war zone, or obtaining temporary residence, and the longer-term temporal implications of resettlement that have traditionally been associated with the concept of migration. What are the different routes, bureaucratic routines, modes of travel, and traveling objects that accompany and inform these varied temporalities of human mobility? How do circular migrations and ideas of permanent temporary work feed into queer temporalities as theorized by Michael Bass? In a recent article on emergency mobilities, Peter Adey examines how particular sets of mobilities occur and are compelled under particular kinds of conditions and forms of governance wielded under emergency politics, its legislation and practices. Displacement, resettlement, and return, he argues, are not only symptoms of emergency, but are productive of the emergency itself. And I think likewise that we could argue that migration policies and border politics are productive of migration and the category of the migrant. At what speed does migration and settling take place, and on whose terms? When might the prospective migrant or settler find themselves reanimated by deportation or expulsion, or the refugee find him or himself returned or deported despite international law protecting against refoulement? Thinking at urban scales, such issues of speed and friction often build on George Zimmel's ideas of urban metabolism and Henri Lefebvre's rhythm analysis, to argue that bodies and objects shape cities and other spaces, and in turn are shaped through their rhythms of movement, their pace and synchrony. There are interferences between the rhythms and temporalities of kinetic elites, for example, such as traveling university professors and academics, and those in what James Ferguson calls the global shadows, such as domestic workers who may have to work in the employ of the kinetic elites, who may have to vacate land for their use or seek to circumvent them. Sometimes the fast temporalities of capital circulation slam into the slow pace of getting things done in faraway places. Other times, the conscientiously slowed temporalities of tourism and leisure conflict with the hustle of people selling goods and services for a living. To describe such differential speeds, we can use the concept of friction, which is a property of material surfaces that meet with each other. Friction does not just slow us down, it also gives enough purchase to move without slippage. So it's not that friction is always bad, we need some friction to move. Friction, as Anna Tsing has put it, produces movement, action, and effect. So how do varied kinds of friction produce different temporalities of movement? Movement not just of the migrant, but of the border itself as it expands and contracts, moves inward and onto racially profiled bodies in some cases. The second temporality that I want to suggest is organizing and sequencing of movement. The logistics of migration at different scales. Who moves, by what means, with what baggage, with which companions, overseen by what authorities? How do migrants organize and sequence their own moves? For example, as described by Brenda Yo, the Filipino migrant mothers in Singapore, how do they manage mobile households through sequencing and organizing their lives and the lives of their family members? The sequencing of movement can often be manipulated through spatial means of governing mobility, as well as temporal confinements of non-permanent states or statuses. So I'm thinking here both of how migrants organize and sequence their movement, and then how governance organizes and sequences movement. So for example, in the context I'm more familiar with, U.S. policy towards Caribbean, Central American, and Mexican migrants shows how the state manipulates refugee law by setting its own legal geographic terms, as Jenna Lloyd has recently argued, through interdiction on international waters, through creating offshore detention camps, and the use of deportation, preventing asylum seekers from reaching sovereign territory requires both offshore and onshore confinement, argues Lloyd, with the prospective migrant experiencing this as a kind of churning movement, a kind of endless vortex in and out of border zones, where the time of crossing and returning is constantly repeated, or detention becomes a kind of permanent limbo, as Lloyd and ALLISON Mounts argue. This is what we also might refer to as turbulence, wherein trajectories of movement are interrupted, pushed off course, and sometimes turned back or held still. It's the quality of how one moves, whether smoothly and seamlessly, or stop and go on a bumpy and dangerous ride, passing through or queuing, staying or being returned, but never able to stop and settle. Many of the papers in this workshop explore the lived time of such mobilities, as Marin Boersma does for Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong, or Son Yang Seo does for temporary labor migration experienced as time out from the life course. So over longer time periods, we might also consider the sequencing of national histories of migration discourses and policies, such as those explored, as I mentioned, in Italy by Ben Giat and Home, where a peninsula with a history as a bridge and a crossroad between many different peoples later became a nation of mass emigration, and at first welcomed immigrants and then later turned against them in some ways. Also related to organizing and sequencing is the growing concern in both migration studies and mobility studies with material objects and the ways in which those objects assist ordering and sequencing. Objects interact with migration trajectories, processes, and memories, and they accompany us and become a sort of talisman, a touchstone for kind of reorganizing the temporality of migration. We have a special issue on mobilities, of the journal Mobilities, on migrant worlds and material culture that was edited by Basu and Coleman. Also, Divya Tolya Kelly has explored what she calls the textural landscapes of migration in the South Asian home in the UK, tracing the meaning of objects in British homes that resonate with landscapes and memories from South Asia, transported via East Africa and into the UK. Mobile communication technologies also may allow for new kinds of materialities through the innovation of mobile money and the sending of money, which becomes also a way of moving goods around the world. This allows for new materialities and networked urbanism that bridge the circulation of goods and capital between migrant sending and migrant receiving locations. These mixtures of physical and digital mobilities are increasingly important to understand migration's temporalities. And that brings me to the third category that I want to speak to, which is the digitalization of temporalities of migration. As moving becomes dependent, not only as it was in the past, on schedules and timetables of trains, planes, trucks, and ships, but also today on the bureaucratic machinery of data collection systems, of the smart border crossing, passport control agencies, court systems, work visas, all of these things that are now digitized and integrated with each other. How do the stop-and-go speeds of mechanical transport now intersect with digital algorithms to affect the process and experience of migration? How are these temporal orchestrations increasingly automated, with big data being embraced as a way to capture, visualize, and act on such mobility regimes, on networked urban infrastructures of communication and smart border crossings, which become sites for cross-tracking mobility? Issues of security, securitization, and surveillance have informed the overlap between mobilities and migration studies. These border technologies help to produce statelessness and conditions of undocumentation. ALLISON Mounts has contributed to analysis of new kinds of security along borders, exploring the stateless zones both within airports and beyond sovereign territory, where a kind of transnational panopticism is exercised through technologies of vision and knowledge. Also, Louise Amor documents changing forms of digital surveillance of those on the move. And in mobilities research, there are many people concerned with these issues and relating them to militarized mobilities, splintered access to mobilities, disaster-related immobilities, disrupted mobilities, and so on. All of these questions, of course, come to a tragic kind of historical climax in the acceleration of unsanctioned mobilities of people seeking to move, but doing so outside the secured channels, that is, crossing the deserts of the U.S.-Mexico border or entering unseaworthy ships on the rough seas around the world. Here, attempts at migration become linked to carceral geographies, to refugee camps, island holding grounds, and a kind of necropolitics where turbulent mobilities and death interrupt tourist utopias and the slow leisure space of the beach. And finally then, I want to suggest one more concept on the importance of temporality as a kind of punctuated immediacy. There's a kind of punctum, to use Roland Barthes' term, in which visual technologies sort of strike us and they animate a reaction, right? They cut to the core. It's notable that the recent crises over refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people are interwoven with attitudes of alarm toward disaster victims, evacuees, internally displaced persons, and terrorists, and that these spill over into political debates surrounding migration and the conditional welcome extended to migrants in many countries today. Acts of terrorism feed into this complex dynamic, setting off discursive waves of reaction and fear of others, however they are defined. There is also a kind of visual vocabulary that circulates, and particular material objects that come to be associated with the idea of a migration crisis and the calls for securitization of borders. So barbed wire, fences, but also rubber dinghies or water bottles and mylar blankets, soldiers armed with machine guns. Oops, not there yet, sorry. And I want to refer once more to work by Hagar Kotef, who sensitively explores the orchestration of such temporalities at Palestinian checkpoints in Israel, showing how regimes of movement in Israel are made via bureaucratic systems of permits backed by a dense grid of physical and administrative obstacles which stop simple daily routines. There is a management of mobilities, not a generalized immobilization, but a strategic application of immobility to specific cases coupled with the production of certain kinds of mobility. So, to end these brief reflections on the temporalities of mobility and migration, I want to turn to Ann Stoller's definition of a colony and think about how we might apply this to the entire world today. Stoller writes of a colony as a place where people are moved in and out, a place of lived, hopeful, desperate, and violent, willed and unwilled circulation. It is marked by unsettledness and regulated, policed migration. A colony as a political concept is not a place, but a principle of managed mobilities, mobilizing and immobilizing populations, dislocating and relocating peoples according to a set of changing rules and hierarchies that orders social kinds, those eligible for recruitment, for subsidized or forced resettlement, for extreme deprivation or privilege, prioritized residence or confinement. So we might ask, in what ways all parts of the globalized world are today organized within a principle of managed mobilities, of which migration is one dimension or expression? What forms of unsettledness shape our dwellings and our mobilities? What temporalities of belonging undo our efforts to connect and to meet others on common ground? These are the kinds of questions I hope to pursue further under the rubric of mobility justice, in an effort to delineate more ethical forms of transport, travel, and migration. I will end there, and I look forward to discussion. And let me just put in a plug for our upcoming conference called Mobilities, Spatial Flows, and Friction of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic, and Mobility, of which I'm the president. So this will be in Mexico City in October. Thank you very much.